This part deals with the purposes of this bill, the bill to get rid of the democracy out of the Regional Council in Canterbury. I think if we're going to understand the purpose of this bill, we need to go back to the Prime Minister's statement at the opening of Parliament, where the Prime Minister said this government will take action this year to remove roadblocks to irrigation in Canterbury. And that is the purpose of this bill. It's important when we look at how this bill evolved, the different steps that it's come through when looking at its purpose. So the first purpose was outlined very clearly by the Prime Minister, and that is to allow more irrigation in Canterbury, and hence more pollution of the aquifer in Canterbury, and hence more pollution of the rivers in Canterbury, and hence taking more water from the rivers in Canterbury and more water from the aquifers in Canterbury, so that those rivers are even lower than they are now, and even more degraded than they are now, even more full of pollution than they are now. That is the purpose that the Prime Minister gave for this bill when he opened Parliament, because he said he was going to take action to get rid of the roadblocks to irrigation in Canterbury. And that's the purpose of this bill. That was the first step. The second step was to appoint a review that was headed up by the industry, by the dairy industry. Now let's remember the Environment Canterbury, its major role is a regulator of the dairy industry in Canterbury. So what did the government do as its second step? It appointed someone from the dairy industry to do a review of the regulator of the dairy industry. Who does this remind you of? Does George W. Bush come to mind when we think about getting the industry to do the review of the regulator of the industry? Of course, George Bush took it one more step. He appointed the industry themselves to be the regulator, and we may yet come to that depending on who the government appoints to be commissioners at Environment Canterbury. So the second step was get someone from the dairy industry to conduct a review of the regulator of the dairy industry in Canterbury, that is ECAN, the Regional Council. And surprise, surprise, the review came back from Mr Creech and it said, oh, we don't like this Environment Canterbury thing. It's slowing economic growth, i.e. it's saying no to some of the irrigators. That is outrageous. We have to abolish this Environment Canterbury because it's saying no to some of the dairy corporations, and that is unreasonable. Of course, the fact that Canterbury has had one of the fastest rates of economic growth in New Zealand, the fact that we have had dramatic increases in irrigation and approvals for irrigation across Canterbury, that doesn't matter. No, we weren't going fast enough, so we had to have more ticks put next to irrigation schemes, more ticks given to dairy corporations, because the review conducted by a director of a dairy company, of the regulator of the dairy industry, says that we should. And so the second step in understanding the purposes of this particular bill is to understand the review that was conducted by someone from the dairy industry of the regulator of the dairy industry. So he came back and he said, oh, you're not going fast enough. It's also important to remember the other things that the review said. It said that ECAN paid too much attention to science. Too much attention to science is what they said. It's an outrage. The regulator of the dairy sector, according to the dairy person who was put in to review it, was paying too much attention to science. It was science-led, it said. Imagine that. Imagine a regional council paying attention to science. It's an outrage. It has to be abolished. I know, says the Minister, we'll abolish it. And we'll put in people that won't pay attention to science because it's wrong. They should be paying attention to the irrigators and the dairy corporations. They shouldn't be paying attention to the scientists. Imagine employing scientists in a regional council to give you information about water quality. Shocking, a shocking activity. That's why Wyatt Creech said it had to go, because it wasn't employing enough people from the industry side. Too many scientists. What a waste of time. Of course, the other thing he said is that it's not processing enough consents fast enough, and of course this is really the nub of the matter. Of course, in the last 12 months, the Regional Council processed nearly 90% of consents within statutory timeframes. Nearly 90%. So when they say, oh, we've got to get rid of it now, actually it's performing better than it's ever performed. That's why they're trying to get rid of it. It's because it's improved its performance. So in terms of the purpose, of this bill, which is the part that we're dealing with at the moment, in terms of the purpose is, Mr Chair.
Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Chair. The purpose is to speed up the process of converting more and more of Canterbury to irrigation, and more so that we can see more rivers drained of their water, we can see more pollution of the aquifers, we can have less science, because that's important. As Mr Creek said, there was too much science being done. What a waste of time. So we can have less science, and then there'll be less evidence from which people can complain about what's going on in Canterbury. We'll have less ability to challenge Synlait and all the different dairy corporations when we go to court, because there'll be less science done. Let's remember, Linton Dairy case was lost because Canterbury Regional Council didn't have enough of the science to prove around the aquifer. So what they tried to do, the Regional Council tried to get more science, and for that they're being sacked. They're being sacked because they're too much into science. The reason they lost the Linton Dairy case was because they hadn't done enough science. So they did more science, and now they're being sacked, because if they've got too much science, they might say no to more irrigation and more intensification of agriculture across Canterbury. And as we know from the Prime Minister's speech when he opened Parliament, this government will take action to remove roadblocks to irrigation in Canterbury. Hence this bill, hence getting rid of the democratically elected regional councillors in Christchurch. I think it's also important this afternoon, people may have seen that Environmental Defence Society, after originally cautiously welcoming this bill, in its second press release has come out opposing this bill because it's realised what is going on with water conservation orders in this bill, because one of the purposes of this bill is to overturn the water conservation orders on the Rakaia and the proposed water conservation order that's coming through on the Huranui. The reason they don't like those water conservation orders is because they'll preserve too much water for the river and not give enough water to irrigation. So they can't possibly let the water conservation order go through. They can't let the water conservation order go through, and EDS has now come out raising serious concerns about what this bill is doing to the water conservation order process. Because what this bill does is it overturns the current process and it takes the Environment Court out of the process, which is where the Huranui water conservation order would have gone next. So one of the purposes of this bill, and I'm surprised they haven't written it there, is to overturn water conservation order processes, because water conservation orders are the national parks of rivers. That's what they are. People don't understand how important water conservation orders are. They are national parks for our rivers. So when this government introduces a bill to dismantle the way that water conservation orders work in Canterbury, it's because they want to mine another kind of national park. They want to mine the Rakaia River. They want to mine the Huranui River for irrigation. It is another kind of mining of national parks, but this time it's our rivers that are our national parks that are at stake. And this government, in the purpose of this bill, wants to overturn the way that water conservation orders work. Mr Speaker,
I'm sorry to interrupt the member, but the time has come for me to leave the chair. This debate is suspended. I shall resume the chair at 9 a.m. tomorrow.